want to thank you and your entire AUSA staff. These are wonderful forums that you put together in Army Aviation Hot Topics, and I always enjoy being a moderator for this panel here, and glad to kick this off. Also to all of our online folks, and a shout out to our Redstone gang. This is certainly going to be of interest to many of those that are online today. I'm going to do a real short intro of this literally star-studded panel that we have in front of you. You have their bios, most of them you already know, so it's going to be very, very cursory. And then we'll get right into a short opening comments from Wally Rugen, who, of course, is the panel chair, but more importantly, as already been pointed out, he's the Army Futures Command, and he's the director of Future Vertical Lift and Cross-Functional Teams, which is of great interest to many in this audience here. And then we'll start with the questions. You should already be filling out your questions if you haven't already. You've never let us down in the past, so please get those questions flowing to me so that we can answer the questions that are on your mind and not the ones that we scripted put together. With that, let me, again, Wally Rugen, who I've just introduced, we already know. You've already heard from General Francis, the Center Commander, this morning, to his right. And, of course, Brigadier General Allan Pepin, Commanding General, U.S. Army Special Operations Command. To his right is Major General Walt Davis, U.S. Army retired, Vice President of Army Aviation Programs, Cypress International. And to his right, Mr. Keith Flail, Vice President, Advanced Vertical Lift Systems for Bell Textron helicopters. And on the end, down there at the end, not to be left out, is, well, wait a minute, I forgot Mr. Chris Van Buiten, Vice President of Sikorsky Innovations, Lockheed Martin Corporation. And finally, Pat Mason, Deputy Program Executive Officer for Aviation Program Executive Office, Aviation. With that done, let me turn the floor over to our panel chair. Wally?
Thank you, sir. The light goes on. There we go. Lack of training. Good morning, everybody, and certainly thanks to AUSA and General Ham, General Swan, and Sergeant Major Preston for hosting us. Always a great event, and we appreciate the stage to kind of get our progress out and what we're working through. We had a great week last week. Ultimately, we were focused in the FVL CFT on leap aheads in lethality, survivability, reach, and sustainment for our future fleet. And I'll get into how we did last week in our signature experiment for FY19. When we talk about our functional concept that's nesting in the multi-domain operations overarching concept, we've just completed about 9 months of high-fidelity modeling. We did that with the UCOM scenario, and we just outbriefed that to Army leadership at our latest touch point. Very well received, and what I can tell you is when we look at kind of the tenets of Army aviation that are forming in the concept, operating from relative sanctuary, using our agility to quickly aggregate, our speed and range to then close the distance and penetrate, be able to use the principles of standoff and overmatch to stay outside of our pacing threats, weapon engagement zones to strike them from a position of relative sanctuary when we get into the penetration phase as well, and in a place and time of our choosing that puts confusion in their decision cycle. Our modeling has really informed our requirements. And then we took that modeling and went out west to Yuma and China Lake and went 11 for 11 on missile shots that I felt were all MDO relevant shots. We had 9 missile shots, 4 in Israel and 5 at Yuma, that kept us, again, outside our weapon engagement zones for our pacing threat. I thought that was a great block zero capability that we got going. And then we really worked hard on our unmanned systems, our architecture, our automation, and our interfaces up at China Lake against a real threat, where in this replicated environment, we were able to show very dynamic and agile tasking of effects. And I think it culminated, just because I don't want to take too much time, but it culminated with a very open system architecture on the Gray Eagle that was demonstrated very effectively, and a dynamic retasking of a GBU-69 in flight. It was going towards one target, and we dynamically retasked it in flight to another. The AMC flew the Gray Eagle from an iPad in the back of a Chinook, and the TOC retasked the missile in flight when a higher priority target came up. So again, we're trying to show that we have standoff, we're trying to show we have overmatch, and we're trying to show we have the agility that the ground forces always relied on when it comes to Army aviation, to just weld the air-ground team tighter and tighter into a pretty solid punch for any potential enemy. Real quickly, just across the programs, I know many of you stay up to date on everything we do. This week we had a great RFP come out on FLRAA. Again, as I told Defense News yesterday, it's a tip of the hat on the multi-year acceleration that the Army is committed to. And that competitive demo and risk reduction, we're happy to kick that off this week. The down select on that competitive demo will be next March as well. And again, it's pushing us in this risk reduction phase as we really just squeeze out everything we've done and all the great teaming we've seen across JMR, and taking JMR from a tech demonstrator to a weapons system. And so we're pleased with that. On FARA, we're seeing great industry work with the 5 OTAs that were awarded in April. We'll look forward to January, where we'll get all the industry submissions back, and again, source selection with the down select in March for our competitive prototypes on FARA. Seeing good work on ITEP. You know, ITEP's going into FARA, and we're seeing great work as they continue to try to converge with ITEP going on the FARA CPs, and that's an Army decision. But again, as I told senior leaders this week, we're on glide slope. We're just not at decision height yet. So we'll get to decision height. We'll call the ball when appropriate, but certainly ITEP has kept us on glide slope with FARA. Our future UAS, I would just say, again, we're pleased to have awarded the future tactical UAS. We're working hard with FORCECOM and the Army staff on the XORD. Those 6 platoons will get those aircraft around about April of next year, and we'll have soldiers putting their hands on what we feel will be a superior capability to what they have now in the BCTs. We'll do it in the training environment and in the demonstration environment, and culminate with a CTC rotation with that. Our air-launched effects also are doing just really showing how decisive the lower tier of the air domain can be when we bring in a lot of our air-launched effects. So the mothership, where it brings in the smaller drones, and the drones start entering that, helping us with the penetration phase, helping us with the disintegration phase. And lastly, just so I don't filibuster the entire meeting, our MOSA, really pleased with what SIMO did last week out at China Lake with a really tough open system architecture problem, and solved it in my mind. And then couple that with our JMR work out of mission system architecture, and then really the great wisdom of Pat Mason down there, helping transition this MOSA architecture from the S&T into the PEO. And I think we've never been more converged when it comes to open system architecture between S&T, Special Ops, and the Army. And we really look forward to that being a game changer. With that, I'll close my mouth and send it along. Sir.
Remarks complete. No, you guys have already heard from me, so I'm going to let these other guys speak. Thanks.
Yeah, I don't have any prepared remarks, but I'll just say to highlight what Wally just said. The collaboration between the community is pretty impressive. And again, I don't have the perspective of doing this my whole career. I do have the perspective when I was the chief of staff at Fort Rucker to see how that six-pack worked. But the information flow that goes across the table to ensure that there's opportunities and to exploit those opportunities to, again, use the soft acquisition authorities that Jeff Downer and the team have to use our integration, the office at what we have at Campbell, that's working with the Wally's team, so we can look at accelerating to learn faster, and if we have to, fail earlier to make those key decisions. And right now, the collaboration is actually showing success. So again, it's been a great part to be this great team. So.
And Al, can I just highlight one thing? You know, SOCOM really came to the forefront and put a funding line in for FVL. And so Al and I were talking last night. I think the comment was, you know, we're not going to cut holes in perfectly good aircraft to make them MH. You know, the work's going to be done on the front end. And so really appreciate SOCOM partnering with us so hard that we're getting it laid in early.
And just double tap that. It was so important that when I briefed General Clark, really in his first 2 weeks of command of SOCOM, I highlighted the importance of investing SOCOM dollars into the RD&D and the benefit long term for this reason. So if we can have collaboration to buy up the requirements are, because we know for the most part that SOCOM will be asked to do things for strategic reasons for our nation, and the future vertical lift capability that SOCOM will most likely get in the future, we want to be nested up front so we don't increase the modernization efforts after we get a Army common system and then spend a lot of money, because we will eventually take systems away from the ground forces and SOF just to be able to overhaul these systems. So this collaboration, and we'll continue to look at through our POM process in SOCOM. So by briefing the senior leaders at SOCOM, it allows us to get through some of the staffing issues that sometimes you get to when people look at a program that may not understand. Now we actually have SOCOM understanding the benefit to SOCOM, our Army, and our nation.
So I quipped to Lieutenant General McQuiston that I'm proud to be part of the 51% that allows the government to be up here at the table to talk to you about the things that you really want to talk about. So thanks. I'm glad to be here. Thanks again for the invite.
Hey, this is a super exciting time for all of us. Industry very much appreciates the partnership with the Army, and it's going to take both of us to pull off the tremendous capability that's required for future vertical lift success. We've been getting ready for this for 10 years. We've been flying technology. You know, we, the industry writ large, thousands of hours complete in highly comprehensive system integration labs, hundreds of ground hours of test, now hundreds of hours of flight test in FARA relevant vehicles and FLRAA relevant vehicles. I loved the focus this morning, maybe most important, on people first. We have hundreds of engineers currently working on future vertical lift, and they have been sharpened by the last 5 years of intense effort building Defiant, Valor, Raider, optionally piloted Black Hawk, and these other exceptional vehicles that are demonstrating future vertical lift technology today in flight. So industry's ready. Look forward to the further dialogue.
Yeah, just to pile on, really appreciate the the opportunity to be up here today with this great group. And from the industry standpoint, hats off to the Army in terms of the pace on FARA and FLRAA. You have definitely challenged us internally, and what you've been able to do to get these documents out in such a timely manner and such a quick turn. We've several times thought they were typos, and they weren't. So working with the contract folks and the attorneys and everything else, how you've been able to pull this off, it's pretty remarkable. Team effort across the board, and we're like Chris said, we're standing by and we're ready and look forward to the next steps. Thanks.
Well, on behalf of Major General Thomas Todd, the PEO, it's a pleasure to be on this panel and be here today and be able to interface with all of you, and I look forward to the questions. I will add, as General Rugen has started off talking about what's been going on lately, as part of this partnership and this team, our job, and as General Todd talks about, is to take those resources and those requirements, all the work in S&T and the experimentation, and to get that laid into a program structure where we understand the risks, we understand the cost, the schedule that's associated with it, and then ultimately be able to produce that capability. And our focus areas are affordability, producibility, reliability, and survivability. And that's really what you see in the competitive demonstration and risk reduction RFP that came out, is how do we translate something that was from the S&T community that is a flying platform into the actual weapon systems capability that we know the field wants. And so in that, I just wanted to highlight that it is the opportunity to get industry's feedback as we explore the trade space so that we can lay in an executable program of record. And so when we did the industry day afterwards, people would come up and they would say, well, hey, I disagree with this section. And my response was, fantastic. That's what we want, and we want you to write back and tell us why. If you look at the draft system spec and it has things in it that don't make sense, that's exactly what we want to hear back. That is the methodology that we're going through right now and why we're using this OTAP, so that we can inform what we will put out in the program of record and how we derive the right trade space so that we can take that back into senior leaders and they can make decisions on how we want to formulate the actual program of record and then deliver the capability in the end that Army aviation needs, the Army wants. So again, on behalf of the PEO, great opportunity to be part of this panel, and I look forward to the questions.
Okay. First question is, thanks for acknowledging the role of Army aviation. How are you integrating Guard and Reserve into the CFT and FVL? And that's, a great question. My chief of staff is from the Army Guard, and he's an Army aviator, Colonel Andrew Batten. Colonel Batten has been with me for a little over a year now. We also have Lieutenant Colonel Matt Kukla out of the Georgia Guard, who is acquisition trained, and he's a deputy G3 of mine. So we're waiting on Compo 3 to send some folks to us. We're working through the paperwork on that, but it certainly is, all Compos are basically represented on the team. But more importantly, when we have a decision brief to the Aviation Six-Pack, we have evolved into what we call Aviation Summits. And the Aviation Summits do include a wider array of Army general officers that are aviation, from the aviation branch, and each one of those Aviation Summits has included at least one, if not multiple, Compo 2 and 3 members. So General Hokanson has been part of that, and General Todd Hunt and Tim Gowan. So we've kept it transparent, and it's important that everyone know that it's a total Army solution.
Yeah, if I could just add to that very quickly, and that's not just within aviation. I will tell you that our Chief of Staff of the Army is very intent on ensuring that we look at the Army as a total force, and that certainly takes place in Army aviation, where 51% of our force is composed of the National Guard and Reserve. So that's a high priority for him, and he won't hold a meeting without the National Guard and Reserves being present when we're talking about aviation systems. So it's important to know that. Okay, so next question is, has there been a debate over whether to bring back armored cavalry squadrons in lieu of attack recon squadrons for FARA fielding, and can you discuss what is being considered? So this is a great question, and I will tell you it's one that's being grappled with across the Army. Just last week, we held a reconnaissance and security summit at Fort Hood that included all Corps commanders in the Army and almost 100% of our division commanders, to include some National Guard division commanders, talking about that capability. As you know, over the years, we have taken from corps and divisions organic cavalry squadrons to do RNS functions. And so the discussion has been, okay, do we need that capability at those echelons? And if so, then how are we going to fill it? I will tell you, we are at the very front end of that discussion right now across the Army, and but it is in fact an issue. It is being pursued, and I will tell you also that every one of those discussions has a complement of aviation in it. We don't think there will be a cavalry squadron that is not an air-ground element or organization as we move into the future. So that is currently in discussion. It's a high priority for the Army's leadership, and they're pressing to get after the answers to those questions, and then how we source those formations in the future, and how many of them we make.
Okay, next question is, can you explain how you messaged the 2 aircraft strategy to Congress, and how the CBO study informed the Army's decision? And I've talked to many of you in this room many times over, and as I've studied and I've gone back and read a lot of GAO reports from the 70s and 80s and 90s, I really feel and I assess that our inflection point is much more like the 1970s, where we did produce 2 aircraft as part of the Big Five, the Black Hawk and the Apache, than it is the 1990s, where because our current fleet in the 1990s wasn't modernized like the fleet coming out of Vietnam, the Army had pressures on both sides, current fleet and future fleet. And that caused a lot of problems downstream with the Comanche being rebaselined up to 6 times. In the 70s, we had the luxury of assuming some risk because the current fleet was modernized, and that's how I assess the current fleet today. We had, and the CBO report out of May of this year backs us up, a very large investment over a little over a decade, kind of right around the surge and later into the teens, where we bought a lot of great aircraft. And those great aircraft are going to be able to bridge us into the future aircraft. And it allows us, affordability-wise and inflection point-wise, to jump to 2 aircraft. Where if you take us to the 1990s inflection point, well, you couldn't even do 1, so how are you going to do 2? Again, I think we're far more in the 70s than the 90s. And again, we keep going back to GMR, but it really has informed what we can do. It really has informed our requirements, and so we're not seeing the trend of perhaps gold plating. We are prototyping, and that's how we're going to stay away from gold plating. We are prototyping to inform our requirements. We are aggressively experimenting to inform our requirements to make sure what we want to do is not, as Mr. Shipley would say, requiring an invention. That's not what we're doing. So I'll stop there on that one. Go ahead, sir.
One of the questions here is what are we doing from a community to make sure the soft FVL version early on, part of the integration, so we don't have to, again, do a major overhaul, and as Wally said, cut holes in aircraft, because obviously with new form factors, that's not going to be as easy. We'll actually just probably increase the cost of doing how we did things in the past. So I think what we've done is we have added the soft requirements. So Wally and his team have integrated those things. We're trying, if they can pre-plumb, for example, air refueling. We know soft will have to have an air refueling requirement. Even though the aircraft will go faster and further, the fact that we will have the operational requirement based on time and station, the required, in some cases, to be able to go through multiple countries to get to a target set, they're going to try to pre-plumb that aircraft. So all we have to do is basically open a pre-designed hole and add a refueling probe, and the system, CAS cockpit, can have the systems that allow you to quickly integrate that system. Buys down the costs, it increases the capability, and it actually decreases your mod time that we would do at our SALSA facility. We're trying to integrate as many of these things with the balance of the cost to actually the final product. So there's an ongoing dialogue. A decision in the future will be our MH6 version. So we have our mission enhanced Little Bird. So that's a SOCOM bill. And right now, ideally, we'd have an Army common program. So if you look at, again, a small aircraft, you take the attack version we're pursuing, if we could actually mod that to also have that assault capability, it would buy down the cost, so you wouldn't have duplicate efforts in SOCOM to have one-off capability. But if it turns out that we cannot, adjust or modify the assault version from the attack version, then most likely SOCOM will have to continue. If the requirement from the ground force, because that's who we support, if the requirement is they need a critical capability to do a small assault force infill capability into a defined small space, whether that's doing shipboard operations or obviously doing urban environment, then we'll maintain that platform, and that'll be a long-term build that SOCOM will continue. And so we've had those discussions. But again, the collaboration is well nested in this process.
Okay, I got the next one.
I was just going to add on just to that real quickly. So not just from an operational perspective, but from an acquisition perspective, the integration that exists these days between what has gone on within Army acquisition and SORDAC really has never been stronger. You now see the transition of people that have worked in both communities that are working on this program. And because of that, there's a very robust understanding of P2 and P11 dollars, how those dollars need to be used, what you need to do to provision up front, the business case that needs to go into that. And so Colonel David Phillips says he's done the system specification flow down in his team. That is all integrated into it and then being brought back up so that they can evaluate the provisioning of the soft unique elements and then bring that back in to the soft acquisition community so that they can make decisions on what would be integrated or potentially not integrated. But I will tell you, it really has never been stronger in the understanding of how to do that effectively up front. And I will tell you, we successfully demonstrated that as kind of the first repetition on the 47 Block 2 aircraft and how we went to a common airframe associated with that, a common center section for that platform so that we did not have to go back and do the major modifications.
Just one comment to build on that. It's been interesting looking at the variants for both FARA and FLRAA almost across the configurations, how easy it is to accommodate in-flight refueling. And it offers, I think, a tremendous opportunity for beyond special operations. The probe will be a fraction of the current length of a probe. The automation will enable very low workload in-flight refuel operations. And the automation will also enable mission durations that aren't currently possible. So the ConOps of having optimally piloted vehicles, remember that could be 2 crew, 1 crew, no crew, with in-flight refueling opens up the aperture significantly of what becomes possible.
That's a great point. Leads into this next question. So the Royal United Services Institute, a UK think tank, believes the FVL ConOps will be obsolete because potential adversaries like Russia will not pose missiles like the SA-21 as the main threat. What is your reaction? So my reaction is, I guess, twofold. So if they don't pose that as their main threat, then we have freedom of maneuver, and vertical lift is always going to be in demand. It's in a voracious demand right now from the COCOMs. I think General Francis briefed yesterday, 83% committed. So if we enjoy freedom of maneuver, great. We'll keep using our stuff. But that's not what we're seeing in Syria. We're seeing if anything, the Russians are bringing more Panzers and more integrated air defense into that theater to counter threats that they see coming at them. And so we still believe and identify the Panzer as our pacing threat, and we need to find, fix, and finish it in quick fashion. And again, I look at it as if we can defeat the Panzer with our ecosystem, the lessers are mostly included. It's not that we're just thinking about the Panzer. We have a layered approach to our aircraft survivability across the full spectrum to include the full electronic order of battle and the full IR, UV, and other spectrums. But the Panzer is what we want to reach out and grab first. Go ahead, sir.
Yeah, if I can just add on to that, I would argue that many of the folks out there that are talking about the survivability of aviation are really using anecdotal examples. I will tell you that the analysis, the physics-based modeling that Wally and his team are doing right now are giving us data and giving us facts. And so I would disagree. I would disagree with the think tank out there in terms of our ability to go after the threat in this highly contested environment. We can do it, and we're proving that we can. Thanks.
If I could jump on that, one of the things that Special Operations Aviation units do, so the regiment of 160th, a couple of years back, focused on Special Operations Advanced Tactical Training, where it's a three-phase approach, where at home station, they bring in all the agencies, they bring in the experts that know about systems that will defeat aviation platforms out there, both fixed wing and rotor wing. So our crew members study this in depth. They use new techniques to assess where systems would be. They do all this home station training, and then they go into their simulator, and they do reps and sets in the simulator against simulated capabilities that we know of. Through that process, a combination of our aviation survivability equipment we have now against known threats, but also tactics, techniques, and procedures, and a combination. Then they go out there to China Lake against live emitters with live controllers, and we go against these systems. And what's pretty impressive is that people operating these systems know we're coming. They know during these blocks of time, we're going to come in with so many aircraft and try to defeat, get to the point where we can penetrate and disintegrate your systems. These are highly trained, alert folks that know how to use the systems, know how to read their radar systems. They're on alert, and we've given them a window when we're coming. And the incredible thing, without going into classified systems, is we're able to enter the threat area, defeat their system between a combination of current modernization efforts as well as our tactics, technical procedures, and get to the point where they know there's something out there, but they can't lock on us. And so we're going to continue this process as we develop the FVL program, because one of the questions here is how are we going to be able to demonstrate this? So we're going to continue to evolve between the platform and the systems and the integrated systems. And we're doing this. In the last one we just did, we integrated the AFSOC assets from the Air Force Special Operations Command. We were using E8 Brawlers to make sure we could see if we could jam systems and our own systems, and a combination in that joint environment, right? So if you look at multi-domain operations, it's not going to be just one platform. We were able to defeat these systems time and time again. And then we come back and we brought in the 101st was there, the 82nd Cab was there. We had elements from other cabs. We brought in the ASDAT team from Fort Rucker. So we're trying to expand not only with our current systems, the enduring systems. We'll use the same process to support this approach of what systems we have on the aircraft and how we defeat. And as agencies find out what these systems are, we'll integrate it into this approach.
Hey, and I just to tag on to what Al's saying, and we're proliferating that in our doctrine, in our aircrew training manuals right now. So as this process evolves, as we develop techniques and procedures with our aviation experts out there, we're turning that back into our doctrine and in our manuals that tell aviators how to do this. So we've actually developed classified TTPs that are being proliferated throughout the aviation force right now. So this is a constant circle that will never end, that we will continue to adapt and modify how we develop equipment and how we train our aviators to counter these threats.
Go sit. Well, I'll just tap on that. We have an aggressive experimentation and demonstration program. We're involved in RIMPAC. We're involved in the Defender Series, and so we're talking to both COCOMs, UCOM and PACOM, and then obviously we're going to be annually out to the Western test ranges to prove out our concepts and to prove out our technology and future capability development to make sure, again, that we're building a bridge that is lethal, survivable, with sustainment built in, and has the reach to fight on the future battlefield. Sorry, Chris.
Just real quick to add to that, industry is bringing a portfolio of technologies that come from other services, other platforms that haven't been seen yet in the rotorcraft industry, but are capable of meeting these survivability requirements. I think it'll be very exciting. For us, Sikorsky joining Lockheed Martin and being able to leverage the full suite of technologies there is exciting for Sikorsky, and I think will be very exciting for the warfighter.
Yeah, jump on that. The team of teams, as we compete for these from industry, to Chris's point, there's a lot of capabilities that we bring. And I think as I've listened to a lot of the MDO conversation, there seems to be a lot of folks stuck on the standoff and the penetration, thinking about day one of the conflict versus thinking about what it looks like on day 10, what it looks like on day 100. When you have these new capabilities and this kind of speed and range and overmatch, what it means during each phase and how you ensure that you have that survivability baked in to deal through each of those phases. And again, it's not the individual systems that will make us platform OEMs. It's that system of systems fighting in that joint context to ensure that the standoff is eroded and all those sorts of things. So it's that leap in capability across all of the Army modernization that's going to make the total difference.
Okay, this is a good one. On FARA and FLARA, how are you ensuring that the solutions you choose will pass CAPE scrutiny and get to a POR? So, we had a good summer. Really, FLARA has had a good year since February, yeah. I told senior leaders we were 9 for 9, and one of those aspects was getting our sufficiency memo from CAPE. So we've gotten the AOA completed for FLARA. We got a great working relationship with the Marine Corps and SOCOM, and the trust was developed with the department to be able to delegate that program to the Army, and that was, I like to say, we've never been closer to the Marine Corps and SOCOM, and I think that's why they allowed us to proceed forward with this multi-service program and the Army Acquisition Executive. And again, we passed one. Now, on FARA, we're outside of 5000.2, but what I've told the department and we've committed to is that we're going to still meet that, AOA standard, and we are kicking that off now. And so you'll see that come out in the coming months. Months being a lot of months. Keith, why don't you take one of your cards?
Yes, I'll answer this one and pass it over to Chris. But from an industry perspective, what are your thoughts on JMRTD, how the collaboration with the government informed industry's ability to meet the Army's requirements for FLARA? So I think the opportunity is the Army stood up Army Futures Command, and the fact that we've executed this joint multi-role program, what that means for the Army to have that opportunity now collectively with industry and government. It's over $1 billion of investment to reduce risk and inform requirements from JMR, and it's been over 6 years. So the reality is, we've got a 6+ year head start on this whole thing in terms of where it's going to go, which is why I think you see some of the things happen at the pace that they are with the FVL CFT, is because the Army had the foresight to go back in 2012, 2013 timeframe to really kick this thing off, to understand what we can do and where we can be. That collaboration with the government, when we were working with Dr. Lewis, and I'm sure it's the same with them, some of the comments that we've had going back and forth between the government and industry is, what was the learning we expected to get out of JMR? And a lot of it was, on the key technologies, we're not going to have to require any inventions, those sorts of things. But the digital thread, the digital enterprise, the design is built philosophy, how we can fundamentally wring out cost and complexity through all the processes, the way that we do things. We can now put everybody in the same 3D environment. We can look at the way we do procedurals much differently than we have in the past. We can apply this central data source across the entire life cycle for the aircraft. So you really get after reducing cost across the entire life cycle of an aircraft, unlike we've had before. So it's that that deflationary aspect that's been talked about a lot in terms of what the technology can do for you. I think it's a model, having participated in it, to the way we've been able to operate as an industry and government team to really bring a lot of these things out that I believe can be leveraged by the other CFTs as they get started with their efforts.
Yeah, I just applaud the industry government team for having the guts 6 years ago to do it in full scale. Not go subscale and, hope that you're relevant. But the two flying prototypes are within, we're analyzing the final, the current spec requirements. But they're within 10 or 20% of the exact scale for FLRAA. So they're highly relevant. And that has all the risk reduction, tool maturation benefits that you'd expect. So I think it was money well spent by both industry and the government.
And I would just say, from having also been on the S&T side in the Army and seen this play out, Bill Lewis, when he set this vision to go do this and got the Army behind it to build the aircraft, it was really about trying to get varying configurations and get as much data as we could. So you had tilt rotor versus a lift offset compound, plus some of the other things that have been done by the other companies that have gone out and gotten the data. Then it really gave us the ability to take a look at what was in the art of the possible as we move to the future. And that was significant as we then go into this next phase, which ties right back into the previous question about going to CAPE. And while everybody wants to look at the flying air vehicle, what Keith talked about as far as the tool maturation, for nerds like me, that actually is really exciting. And I know for most of you it will bore you to death. But the tool maturation that has occurred underneath it is critical as you look at the overall affordability, which is what CAPE is going to look at, how we do our cost estimating, how we understand the amount of scrap and rework when you get to producibility and the things that I talked about at the beginning. And so that tool maturation coupled with the configuration data that we've got has set a tremendous foundation for us to move forward. And that plays in great part to why we feel confident in going forward to OSD and to CAPE, that we can lay out the affordability arguments or the affordability trades through this next phase of FLRAA and then as we move forward with FARA. And it really is built on the foundation of what's been done in this collaboration. And I will tell you, there's got to be additional collaboration in that same vein to ensure that we actually instantiate this really digital engineering community, right, and how we translate that information, because digital thread briefs well, but we've got to have the right infrastructure on the government side to the industry, and then how it comes back in as CDRLs. And that's part of what we're trying to do in the PEO right now, to actually build out that infrastructure and turn what was an S&T project into the actual reality of how we execute acquisition programs.
All right, I'll take one here. So it's if air refueling will be a soft requirement, why isn't the big Army making it a requirement for FLRAA to capitalize on its speed and range? And the answer is that hadn't been determined yet. The goal, as you heard General Pepin and Rugen talk about already, is to design the aircraft so that you can plug and play those capabilities as required. What I think you're going to find in the future is that not everybody's going to get everything. We can't gold plate everything, and so as a unit with a specific mission set has a requirement, we'll identify those and then make sure that we have the capacity in the aircraft that is designed to plug that in as required. Any other comments on that one?
And, right, we don't need to decide yet. I don't think it's going to be ubiquitous. I think when you look at our challenges in the Army and Indo-PACOM, we are certainly going to run that through the model and see what it gives us, what it doesn't. But the whole DOTLM PF, having lived the dream of having to maintain currency on aerial refueling crews, there's not a lot of tankers out there that are just coming to beg you to come plug. So the Army would need to look at that capacity from the other services as well. So it's not just one niche question. It has downstream impacts. But we've been asked that question, and we will run the numbers and see if the operational maneuver or tactical maneuver bang for the buck is enough for the actual funding resourcing bang for the buck. Any other questions on that or comments on that? Go ahead.
Another question here. With the Army wanting to field first units for FLRAA and FARA in 2030, is industry prepared to ramp up and meet that timeline? Is industry concerned about the potential budgetary impacts on that timeline? What are the risks for industry? Industry absolutely has the capacity to develop these assets, FARA and FLRAA, deliver them in this next decade, and ramp up to meet the production. One of the fascinating risks in this is, one, we are investing a lot, of the order of $1 billion. You can't afford to invest that much and have it not come to fruition. So we're all invested as a team to make sure we actually bring it to fruition and leverage all the investment in technology maturation we've made. And then the fascinating dynamic, you'll look at Sikorsky. We make Blackhawks, and FLRAA is designed to replace the Blackhawk, right? I'll tell you, we had a fascinating executive board meeting at Sikorsky about 8 years ago, where a team had the guts to stand there and say, we would like to start the campaign to replace Blackhawk. And the discussion immediately went to, Sonny, do you know what's paying your mortgage? Right? And yes, sir, fully aware. But look at the fascinating behavior that you've got industry aggressively working to replace itself. We do think the Black Hawk will continue to improve, spiral, and fly past 2050 and do amazing things in that duration. But we get it, that we need to make this leap to keep us viable on the modern battlefield. But that's a fascinating business risk, for us. As you keep Black Hawk production going, do you keep the entity alive as we're transitioning to the new platform? I think we've each had questions around production capacity, and I don't think that's going to be an issue at all. I'm sure it will be throttled by affordability, just budget, not enter in industry capacity.
But I was gonna add, just from our perspective, certainly we are very focused on the industrial base and some of the fragile aspects within the supply chain. So as you transition production to new air vehicles and new components, you still, and this is kind of this afternoon's panel, you still have to sustain the enduring fleet. And when you look at the supply base, not the Lockheed Martins or the Boeings, but their suppliers, many of whom they have in common, then how do you effectively do that to ensure that those businesses can machine, they have the right infrastructure to do that, and they can maintain multiple configurations now? Because instead of doing, let's say, a line that simply supports the Echo model transmission, they may be asked to support transmission build, i.e. gears that go into that transmission on multiple different variants. And so that is something that as we move forward through this, it's not just about can I build the aircraft at a factory, it's delving into the supply chain and the robustness of that supply chain to deal with multiple different configurations of supporting component parts, right? Drivetrain components, gears that go in transmissions, right? And I'm looking over at the GE folks, the engine components that need to go in that as well, given you're going to have multiple different engines that are out there as well.
Yeah, it's interesting. We at Bell also had a conversation about replacing the Black Hawk, but
That's great.
but it
Yeah.
I think it might have gone a little bit differently, but it's crazy how they have same thing happen.
A little less debate.
Yeah. So
Bring it on.
talk about FLRAA and FARA combined. Look at Bell years ago when we had the Huey, the Cobra, and the Kiowa. And what we were doing for processes in terms of how manual and analog and everything that we did to pump out those kind of quantities. So you look at just as an example of where industry was and where industry is now with all the things we can do in this digital environment and all the things we've been able to prove out even with our first aircraft, our first prototypes that we've done, and applying all these digital technologies, manufacturing technologies to everything. That I think absolutely we're in a much better position to do this now than we were back then, where a lot of that was just done by sheer brute force to get that many aircraft into the inventory. One of the concern about the budgetary impacts on that timeline, I think we've had great dialogue with government and industry going back and forth as we look at some of these new processes in terms of OTA and the cost share associated with that, and MTAs. But some of the things we're still working out is long lead. That's one of the fundamental differences here in terms of how are we going to do that as a team in terms of the significant long lead that's required and the bills that go with that. That's one of the things that we're still hammering out, and I'm sure we'll get to resolution on that. And what are the risks for industry? I think Chris touched on it. Is that the risk is to not move out, and it's more than just the risk to the industry. What's the risk to our nation, to our national security in terms of when do you go to the next thing? You know, we have great kit that our soldiers fight with every single day, but technology continues to move forward, and then you're always in that argument of, well, no, we should just wait for the next big technology. We should wait for the next one, and then you find yourself in the TRL circle of death, where it's not mature enough, so you can't go forward. But maybe we should wait for it. But you know, so when do you snap that chalk line and move out? And you know, happy to see what Army Futures Command, what the Army has done to lay this in terms of moving out with the next chapter for the Army.
And I would just say to pile on, you know, it gets into our kind of bumper sticker is you can't afford not to. And so when you look at the industrial base and you see the buyouts, and certainly the Army is the biggest consumer of rotary wing industrial base capacity, if we don't lay this in, we're going to see a lot of those industrial bases go fallow because we're going to buy out our requirement. And then you've made a decision as a nation to walk away from one of these great plants with the craftsmen that build these great vehicles that allow us to fight and win. And so it's not a small question. It's a very big question. And when you look at the synchronization, we got to hit our marks. We got to deliver, both from the government and the industry perspective. But there's a little bit of urgency, too, because on the industrial base side, we do buy out our fleets, and then what? Okay, next question. Comanche had specific low observable requirements. Will there be low observable requirements for FARA and FLAR airframes? And no, there won't. Our modeling, radar clutter and hiding in the radar clutter is a thing. We've decided to go all in on our reach, which is speed, range, and endurance at range. RF propagation is understood far more than it was in the 90s with our high-fidelity physics-based models. We understand how RF energy propagates and what problems it has at low altitude. I hate to break it to everybody, but the low altitude or the lower tier of the air domain is going to be decisive. It's not that we have a problem. Our modeling's saying we're pretty damn good in it. And I think all the high flyers have a problem where the air is clean and the RF energy is propagating in a linear fashion up top. Down low, we like where we're at. And it's dirty, we can hide in it, and if we build that overmatch and standoff, we're going to be decisive.
Yeah, and I would just also add to that, and General Pepin alluded to it earlier, we never look at survivability from any one standpoint, meaning there is no technological solution alone that we consider. We consider across the board training, techniques, tactics, procedures. We fight that against live threats out there on a continuous basis to experiment to inform how we train our aviation force out there. So it's like I said before, it's a continual process. Technology is one aspect of it, but training, TTP development, and getting our experts out there flying against these systems is another way that we inform the process and how we're making ourselves more survivable out there.
An interesting technology note, that high speed, low altitude in the clutter ingress is largely in, not to offend anyone, in excess of human capability. Of course, everyone in this room would be able to do it, but maybe the normal. So high degrees of autonomy are required to achieve that ingress at high speed at the altitudes required. And it's not replacing that aircrew, it's augmenting that aircrew, eliminating controlled flight into terrain during that nighttime, stormy, low altitude, high threat, controlling ALE environment. But that's an exciting difference that you're going to see in the future vertical lift generation of aircraft.
I think what you've seen at the National Training Centers, the CTC centers, I mean, what FORSCOM has done to overhaul, to get after, decisive action, the environment. And again, we learn the most through hardships and failure, and the Army is putting through our BCTs and that collaborative commanders teams through some rigorous hardships. Probably more so than they'll face on any given day in combat, because they're getting overwhelmed with the cyber, the Cyberny issues, ACE, now that we're putting aviation elements going out to China Lake and coming into some training emitters. So it's complicated. They realize you can't stay in one location too long or you're going to get destroyed. So it's forcing BCTs and all the enablers to how do you continue to fight, move, and communicate repetitively. And in some cases have increased communications, in some cases that discipline initiative to execute the commander's intent, in some cases that means what outcomes. And so all that, I think, in the future, as we develop these systems and the CFTs as a whole, I think as they go to these CTCs in that more competitive environment, those lessons learned both from the experimental phase but also in our training phase will allow the Army to continue to adapt through that tough, realistic training and hardship to make sure the lessons are learned faster and adapted faster by the Army before we put our men and women in harm's way.
Okay, we got one here. As the Army is looking at fielding FLRAA and FARA in 2030, how is the Army addressing strat lift for the future? We have limited C-17s and C-lift. So that is absolutely a discussion that's happening all the way up at the Department of Defense level because it is a concern. We got to be able to get to the fight, and those are beyond anybody sitting at this table's pay grade discussions that are going on. What I will tell you is, as we address this issue as regards to future vertical lift, that they will have to be transportable by all those means. But the additional capability that we bring with the reach and the speed is the ability to self-deploy in a lot of these cases. So in some respects, what the capabilities of future vertical lift is going to bring us is the ability to get there on our own while other assets are being moved by those other limited assets that you talk about. So it is a physics problem that is being addressed at the highest levels. I will tell you that we'll have the option to go both ways with the introduction of the capabilities of future vertical lift. Anything you want to add on to that one?
No, sir. Again, I think the reach speaks for itself. It gives us a lot of opportunities. Another question here. As we develop future vertical lift and other aviation capabilities, are we collaborating with allies and partners? How are they contributing? We've had an ongoing international IPT really run out of Rucker and Ramsey Bentley for a long, long time, and Mike Burns, the TICM FVL, has picked that up. I think what you're seeing is our requirements coalesce and Army leaders have approved our requirements. You're going to see more and more sharing of those requirements with our allies. Certainly the Australians are very interested, the Dutch, the Brits, the Japanese reached out to me about a week and a half ago, so we're seeing great demand out there from our allies and partners. You're going to see an international plan probably that models other successful programs that the Joint Service has done. We're glad to have these partners come on board and adopt what we're developing.
And I would add to that you're really tapping into a much larger question, which is interoperability, not just within aviation, but across the force. How we allow our allies to enter and exit our networks, have situational, shared common operational picture as we fight these things. Similar capabilities, radios that we can talk on with each other as well. So this is it's actually a much larger and more complex challenge that we have. My new deputy, Ken Cole, just coming from Europe, got to live that as the 12th Cab Commander, and he'll be up next in the training panel to talk that. But interoperability is a challenge. And as we bring these new systems on, I think it's imperative that we include our allies and partners in that effort because we're going to fight with them in the future. And we can't just be a one-off out there. We got to be able to do it collaboratively and with an understanding of each other's capabilities, limitations, and what we bring to the fight.
Yeah, one of the things that we have the opportunity to do on the industry side as well is, looking at the technologies, looking at tech transfer, looking at export policy, those sorts of things, so that when you're executing multi-domain operations with the coalition, that we can meet there at the right time. So when the Army does make the decision that they want to do foreign military sales, and you want this to go to the trusted allies that you've just mentioned there, that we've done the legwork in the background to be looking at those things, and we're not trying to do it after the fact where we have a tech transfer issue or something else that's going to prevent us from even getting policy to be able to do it, so that you can have that interoperability that's required.
We're seeing intense interest for both FARA and FLRAA scale aircraft in the markets we serve all around the world. We're holding off and following the Army's lead on that, but there's intense interest.
I think just to the larger, question, which gets into foreign military sales, I mean, allies and partners, but across PU Aviation right now, we've got about $55 billion in FMS sales that we're working. I know many of you are aware of that because of the companies that you work for, but I think it shows the robustness of the FMS market. And to go back to my previous comment on the criticality of that for the sustainment of the industrial base as well. So as we look to the future, how much does FMS fill the lines that we have on the fleets that are already being produced? And we are fully committed to that. In fact, to give my boss latitude to go do his job, I spend a lot of my time dealing with all that Keith talked about with DSCA and DASADEC and USASAC and everyone else to ensure that we have everything in place so that we can execute those FMS transactions, because we do understand the criticality of it, not only to building partner capacity, but also to the industrial base. I did want to shift just because I do have a question here that ties to what General Francis discussed on interoperability, and it was with MOSA, how are the other services, aviation and ground elements being included for a joint communication ecosystem as we move towards MDO. So General Francis talked a little bit about partners, but certainly there's been lots of I'll say, concern or questions on the joint communications ecosystem. So as General Rugen had talked about earlier, and it's been mentioned, the network CFT leading that effort on what the different waveforms will be, can be anything from Link 16 saddle, MADL technologies, what are the next ones of those, down to air-ground networking and TSM, right? There's a whole slew of them. And we recognize that as those continue to mature over time, whether it's the enduring fleet or the future fleet, we have to have the ability to more rapidly integrate those different waveforms on board the aircraft and transmit that data into the crew and to the operators, whether they're in the front or in the back of the aircraft, so that they have it. And so when you look at doing that, I mean, that's the first instantiation of that where we'll get, I'll call it a rep, and it's nested underneath the architecture framework that we're building for MOSA for the future vertical lift, but it's our aviation multi-core server. So that RPP came out of Aberdeen. It is being run out of our AMSA office, Aviation Mission Systems and Architecture, underneath Colonel Jonathan Frazier. And the purpose of that is to look at how we build the next generation of improved data modem, which is more than just a data modem, but it will allow us to ramp on and off different waveforms, different radio technologies that would then allow us to get that information onto the bus so that we don't have to go through a major OFP upgrade every time that we need to go do that. That also gives us the ability to host things that many of you have developed, which are some of the gateway processors that allow us to do cross-domain solutions, as well as if I want to transition between different waveforms because I'm receiving on a TSM waveform and then I want to put that out on Link 16, or I'm getting some SA picture that I want to be able to push down to somebody who has an Android tablet. And so that's an important program as we continue to evolve MOSA, and how both for the enduring fleet, as we keep the enduring fleet viable for MDO, that we ensure interoperability with that fleet, while it also builds to the future fleet as well. And so again, people have asked me, is that different than MOSA? And I will say no, it's actually a subset of what we're doing for the larger MOSA effort for future vertical lift.
A couple things on that. We will be backward compatible with the current fleet. That's a principle that we are committed to. Secondly, last week we did demonstrate some CapeSat 23 waveforms out of the network CFT on aviation platforms, and pretty proud of that. We have more to do, but we were happy to see that come in far accelerated from our initial estimate. And so again, our experimentation team did great work there. And again, out at Yuma and China Lake, we had 3 CFTs participating. What you'll see going forward is all 8, and in our signature, again, experimentations, you'll see them coming to help us and work with us. We will be deeply interoperable across all the CFTs. It gets into what General Francis said earlier as far as the joint force, but really within the Army force, as an air-ground team, we have to be welded together, and we will be, and we're working towards that. General Kaufman yesterday at Defense News also said that he and I talk about 6 to 7 times per week, and we do. And it's always on how are we going to make sure the air-ground team is effective in that future fight? How are we nested? Are we interoperable? And I talk about 3 to 4 times with Colonel Rafferty to make sure that our fire and maneuver teams, at which aviation is an integral part of both, again, are integrated and deeply interoperable.
Okay, looks like we have time for about one more question, and this one relates to the overall discussion about interoperability as well as the MOSA. So as UAS threat capabilities increase, specifically in ISR and fires roles, to counter UAS, a mission within the FVL ecosystem is counter UAS a mission within the FVL ecosystem, and if so, what platforms would be equipped to counter that threat? So I would start by saying that the counter UAS proponency is actually in the Fire Center, not in the Aviation Center of Excellence. So our Fire Center is the proponent for that, and they're looking at multiple ways to look at the counter UAS threat. But this, again, relates to a much larger question of, because, it's interesting, Wally has folks coming to his door every day saying, hey, I'd like to put X, Y, or Z sensor or capability on any one of FARA, FLARA, future tactical UAS, or ALE, and do that. So there are multiple folks that are recognizing that, hey, this is, if we just put one more thing on this platform, then we'll be good to go. I think as we mature this capability, we're going after Wally's fundamental lines of effort. And then as we move forward, the MOSA will allow us to determine which additional capabilities, or be it a sensor, be it some other capability that are actually go on these platforms. But what the MOSA does for us is enables us to be flexible enough to take those into consideration without major high-cost modifications to the aircraft or major high-cost new programs that would potentially come into any of these platforms. So I think that's an important part and a fundamental part of what the CFT is doing as we look at the modular open system architecture to make sure that we can integrate capabilities without breaking the bank.
Does anyone have any closing comments?
I'll just throw this out there. I mean, a lot of the dialogue is about, again, that large-scale combat operations that we obviously must, fight and win in. But the future vertical lift and all the efforts going on and all the modernization, that's going to enable us, hopefully, to win in the competitive space. So there's a lot of benefits to FVL, both on the conventional side and the soft side, that's going to make us more competitive in that competitive space. And so we can't just lose sight that, the only thing we need this for is for, complete combat operations. Because if we win the competitive space, then we actually won without the cost of men and women.
And I'd add, FVL is going to enable us to win in the competitive space on the battlefield, but enable industry to win in the commercial, or the global helicopter market. It's going to enable U.S. manufacturers to have the leading edge technology, the leapfrog technology that'll be desired and competitive around the world. It's keeping the nation sharp.
All right, I guess we can sum it up by, I always thought of it as giving the enemy multiple ways to die and letting him choose. And that's really what we talked about today. And that's the way you win. So let's thank our panel here for a great job here.